Good morning, everyone. My name is Jonathan Wilkes. I'm the security architect of Palo Alto Networks, and I'm here to talk about automation to prevent internet exposures becoming incidents. Next slide, please. I wanted to start off the conversation with the story of Bob, the sysadmin. We probably all know Bob or someone like him. He's a hardworking guy, but in this case, he made a critical mistake. He was setting up a new server in the cloud, a Windows server, and for one reason or another, he exposed the remote desktop protocol, also called RDP, to the internet. If you're not familiar with the remote desktop protocol, it's what's used for Windows machines for management connection. You should never have to connect to the internet. Because in this case, what happened was the attacker was able to scan, find it, and exploit it with a brute force attack. And Bob comes in the next day and he sees what you see on the right-hand side there. That's ransomware. No one wants to come in and see that because it means your company is probably going to have hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage and potentially mainstream news. To add insult to injury, this means your security operations center is going to be working double time to clean this up. Next slide. So, as I mentioned before, I wanted to state that that's not just a story. We see it more often than you expect. And I want to emphasize that these little internet exposures can become big security incidents in no time at all. As I mentioned before, the attackers, they're using automation as well. They're scanning the internet and able to find these vulnerabilities, sometimes as quick as 15 minutes from when the CVE is published. We've seen RDP blow up as one of these attack vectors. A lot of it's because of COVID, increased remote work, but we're also seeing it in the cloud a lot as well. And we've seen a lot of these ransomware incidents off, as brute force attacks, or we've seen actually more than 50% of successful ransomware incidents come from RDP as initial attack vector. So what I want to state here is that if your organization is focusing on security incidents, which a lot are, which is the later part of Bob's story, where it's already become ransomware, it's too late. We need to start being proactive and focusing on automating the remediation of these internet exposures. So what your game plan could be is to use automation to determine these exposures, collect information on affected assets, and shut down the exposures fast with minimal disruption. Next slide, please. One important part of this is going to be determining what your actual exposures are and your attack service, which is what assets are allowing incoming connections from the internet. This used to be really easy with on-premise networks, but it's gotten more complicated with multi-cloud, shadow IT, Internet of Things, bring your own device, and also mergers and acquisition. So a lot going on this slide. I want to start from the bottom that really what you need is something that's going to be able to determine what your exposures are, and this is going to be an automation system. So maybe you give it some information to feed off of, like you give it your root domain, and from there it's able to resolve what IP addresses are involved with that domain, and then if there's certificates or cloud resources as well. And then from there, you're going to determine what service is running on that asset. A particular IP could be a web server, a piece of networking gear, a building control system, or other. And then there's going to be risk involved with all these services. We mentioned RDP as a common ransomware vector, but there are other critical ones as well. Maybe you're running insecure SSL ciphers on your certificate, or maybe you have a piece of software like Apache or PHP that's not patched, and that's a vulnerability as well. So really want to talk about this solution to scan the internet for your assets and determine the exposures. It's going to be typically called your external attack surface management system. In the end, it's going to find those exposures and then create an alert, which is going to be important for this automation of actual remediating those exposures. So there's other players in this game that you need the automation to communicate with. The first one is your IT asset management system, which is going to keep track of all your IT systems and who manages them. So this is going to be important for the automation to determine who the owner is so that you can notify them of the exposure. Vulnerability management system is very similar to attack surface management, except instead of doing external discovery, it's going to be doing more scanning from the inside of your network and from a known asset list. But a lot of those have really great APIs that you can pull information on the assets, and some of them have ownership information as well. Cloud service providers typically have great APIs to pull information on the asset, If you can't find the ownership from the API, you can potentially look at iLogs as well. And you can also pull information like tags to help determine if this is a development environment or not. So some of the challenges involved with the actual remediation of these exposures, the first one is that asset management is typically a challenge for most organizations. It's hard to keep up with these rapidly changing environments, whether it's cloud, containers, bring your own device. And you need to have that accurate asset management to determine who the owner is so that you can notify of the exposure. Unknown business impacts also a concern because not a lot of organizations have a clear application dependency diagrams, so it's hard to determine if an asset is dev, production, both, something other. And this really ties into trust and automation and making sure it's not going to break stuff. And also lack of resources is a challenge as well, that we find that many exploited exposure and vulnerability is actually known, sometimes as much as 90%. So this can be an issue of prioritization, resources, or expertise. We're seeing that there's a huge imbalance out there that takes attackers seconds to scan for vulnerability, but takes organizations days or longer to determine the issue and then actually remediate. And we know that automation can help with all of these. And so there's a lot going on here. This is an example of what automation could do, the functionality to eliminate RDP exposure in the cloud. So we're going to start from the left to the right. In the first one, we see that the attack surface management solution is going to be scanning the internet. It's going to find that RDP was exposed on a particular IP address. In the second part, we're going to see that an alert was generated by the attack surface management system, and from that, the automation is triggered. Number 3 is we're usually going to do an additional scan to make sure that this issue is still present. A lot of times, these exposures are temporary, like someone turning on RDP for a few hours. And next, we're going to use API calls to reach out to these third parties, the IT asset management system, the cloud service provider, the VM, vulnerability management system, to see if we can find potential service owners. We're also going to reach out to them to help see if we can get some clues of if it's a development environment or not. Once the service owner is once the service owner is found, we want to notify them either through email, ticketing system, instant message. And this is a lot of times because the vulnerability analysts will have access to the system to make changes, so we'll have to notify the actual service owner and tell them what they need to do to fix the exposure. We want to get the vulnerability analysts involved to do a double check to make sure that we found the right service owners and that the environment is really a development environment. But as the automation is improved and some trust is gained in it, they can be less involved and focus on the more critical alerts out there. With actual remediation, typically clouds have some great APIs for security controls. In this case, for RDP, you could set up some firewall rules just to block RDP from the internet. In the top right, you see that example that RDP is using TCP 3389, and you could have 2 rules. The first one that allows all private IP ranges to still connect into the device, so that if there's a VPN connection or bashing host, the system admin can still connect in and manage the device. But the second rule would be to block all internet connection, which is to effectively shut down the exposure. So the step 9, we want to do another scan similar to step 3, in which we're verified that RDP has been closed off. This is going to be important if we're passing this off for another service owner to actually do the change themselves. We're double checking that they did their due diligence. And last but not least, the summary report can be generated as documentation or sent to the service owner. So I really just want to see that, or clarify that, mistakes are going to be made. There's going to be bots out there that are going to expose RDP and other things. So it's good to have a system, an automation system like this that's able to determine what your exposures are and fix them quickly. So we talked about some of the challenges here, some potential solutions. We can see that API calls to the cloud service provider, IP asset management system can find the service owner. In the case that they can't, you could prompt the vulnerability analyst to get involved and to do some investigation. And this is a great opportunity for the automation also to update the remote system. So if you can't find the owner in the IT asset management system, you can potentially update it so that if you have another alert in the future, this is a non-issue. For ongoing business impact, we can see that we can do some pattern matching on the host name to determine if it's a development environment or not. We can also pull some tabs from the cloud service provider as well to do the same thing. Having this ability really increases trust and automation that it isn't breaking production workloads. Lack of resources, we can also see the automation can be used to automatically remediate if there's enough trust in it. The hope is that problems fixed in the lower levels, like in development environment, don't lead to production. And the goal is to have more alerts closed out with automation and less with analyst intervention. And last, some open questions out there, some food for thought, some continuing challenges, is that zero-day vulnerabilities are always going to be a challenge to detect what they are, and then remediation for them can be challenging as well. Sometimes you can reuse the same remediation, like maybe it's one that you could block a certain port like RDP, but that leads us to also testing remediation can be a continuing challenge, and testing it with the smallest blast radius. A lot of organizations don't have development environments for all their security controls. For example, seeing a dev environment of Active Directory or an endpoint solution is a lot less common. And then the last, we want to strike a balance for getting the vulnerability analysts involved. Maybe in the beginning of the process, they'll be touching every single alert, but as some improvements have been made and some trust has been gained from the automation, they could be less and less involved. And so I wanted to thank you for watching my presentation, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Yeah, the external attack surface management, to me, it's like no-brainer. Like everyone should do this. Like I said in my talk, it is being done to you, whether you know it or not, right? It could be done by a commercial firm or adversary. So, my view on it is you may as well do it yourself, right? Or use an outside firm to do it to understand what you got there. There is a distinction between what someone can see from the outside as an unprivileged user, right? Versus what a company themselves can see as a privileged user, right? Have you guys kind of looked into, especially when it comes to the cloud assets, right? So scanning, first doing discovery, scanning your cloud footprint, because I think you had a stat there, said a Fortune 500 company launches 3.5 new cloud services every day, right? Yeah. Have you looked into sort of that distinction between the external attack, surface management, and then doing it as a privileged user, and then the benefits of the latter?
Yeah, so I brought up the vulnerability management system because they traditionally do that, and there's some overlap, whether, ASM is a part of VM or vice versa. They traditionally do that, but it's definitely, you want to have automation that's going to, involve that. And that's why I brought them in, because they're already doing that from the inside to some degree, and they have a lot of valuable data. Like a lot of times they have information on the asset, or they have, ownership information. So it's good to have the ability to integrate with a lot of different vendors, a lot of different other solutions out there.
Hi, great talk. So one of the things I wanted to ask a question on is, I think you had in your slide there, you had an analyst intervention, right? Analysts will come and look at it. How do you differentiate? What are the thoughts about training or differentiating between what analysts should be looking at and what they should ignore? Because I guess the question that I'll get to is, how do you differentiate bad business practice from malicious activity? Because let's say in a company at our size, we might have one technology one year, we switch to technology next year. Then it becomes bad business practice. Not necessarily bad, but it's an old software that we use. And what are you telling the analysts to look at and differentiate on?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would probably have to talk a lot about it to answer it. But I think it's a problem of security operation or security automation as a whole, that it's all about doing automation to increase the efficiencies and determine if something is malicious or not. I've seen this done for phishing, that a lot of times the phish button, someone's email client, is more of, a lot of people are just clicking on spam, right? in this case for exposures, I think the like low-hanging fruit is something that you can determine. It's definitely a dev environment, and you can determine who the service owner is. And in that case, and if you're able to remediate it too, it's a no-brainer. Let's take care of that. And the hope is, again, that you have analysts dealing with less of those and focusing on the ones that are more questionable. But
Okay.
hey, maybe this is dev, maybe it's not, or who's the service owner kind of deal.
Cool. Yeah. So like security context kind of a thing. The context in which the operation is happening.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Cool.